is being recorded. Awesome, y'all. Well, again, welcome to our workshop, Empowering Our Communities Why Muslim Votes Matter. During this workshop and event today, we will delve deep into the ballot and discuss actually what will appear on your ballot this year. For those of you who haven't voted yet, you will receive access to our voting resources, including our ballot lookup tool. And then we will discuss in depth the offices that will appear on the ballot, the roles and responsibilities of these offices, and how they impact you before moving into a discussion on some of the statewide constitutional amendments and ballot referendums that are being proposed. But without further ado, we can go ahead and introduce ourselves and our organization as well.
Okay, so GAMVP, or Georgia Muslim Voter Project, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we aim to empower American Muslims to exercise their civic rights to the fullest extent possible. This is done through community-based voter engagement and grassroots organizing. GAMVP's mission is to uplift Georgia's Muslim voices through voter registration, engagement, voter education, and advocacy. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Arshila Huda. I am a community organizer, and I primarily focus on that education and advocacy. And this is a great example of just one of our many voter education efforts. And I'm going to pass it on to my peer, Asim.
Thank you so much, Arshila. Assalamu alaikum all. My name is Asim Javed. I am a senior community organizer with Georgia Muslim Voter Project. I've had the pleasure of being with the organization now for a little over 3 years. Alhamdulillah, we have been able to do a lot of direct engagement with Muslim community members across the state. One of the things that we emphasize this year is that we first and foremost understand that our communities are feeling so many different things about being told to vote, about being told to be civically active, as well this year with everything that is happened in Gaza, in Sudan, in the Congo, so on and so forth. We just want to say first and foremost that we hear you and we understand you. Uh, Through this platform, we simply want to outline the ways that our participation in this election and generally in civic engagement can be beneficial to our community long term. And we will highlight some of the ways that we have built power for our community as well. Yeah, so once again, thank you all so much for joining us. And we'll go ahead and move to the next slide.
Yep.
So just to give you a quick overview of today's agenda, we'll talk about power. We often hear that word, but we'll really outline what it means for generally and then what it means for our community. We'll talk about the ways in which Muslim communities have built power historically through our civic engagement in different ways. We'll talk about some important voting and election related information and what you need to know to vote in 2024. Then we'll go into a discussion on what's actually going to appear on the ballot this year and give you access to some of our really helpful and important tools. And then from there, we'll wrap up with a short discussion on ways that you guys can get involved with Georgia Muslim Voter Project. We have plenty of engagement and volunteer opportunities, and inshallah, would love to see a lot of you coming out and supporting our work and building your own civic engagement practice long term.
Okay, so before we get started, we're going to do a little activity, and I'm going to ask y'all the question of any feeling y'all have towards the 2024 November election. I'm going to have Asim paste the link in the chat, and it's just asking you for any feelings that y'all have, and I believe it gives you 3 options, so or 3 platforms for you to put in any feelings that you have towards the November election, just for us to get more of an insight on how y'all feel. And it's completely anonymous as well. So it's not going to tell us who said what. It's just for us to get more of an insight. Exciting.
Definitely. I dropped the link in the chat once again. Feel free to open that or visit it on top. And again, the purpose of this is just so we can hear directly from you. We want to know how you are feeling about this election and about our civic engagement generally to better figure out how we can support you in the future as well. So let's just take about 30 seconds to all fill that out, please. Mhm. Definitely. I think we are also, as community organizers, feeling a lot of these same feelings that are shared here. We have things like jaded, unheard, irrelevant, frustrated, exhausted, undecided, confused. Um, First, just want to say, all of these feelings are incredibly valid. And it's
Mhm.
just as a result of everything our community has gone through in the past few years. And hopefully, by the end of today's session, we can make you feel at least slightly more empowered about why our participation in this election and civically is so important. And we can start to continue to build that long-term civic engagement within our community and hopefully help to address some of that confusion or feelings of being unheard or frustration with the system.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Awesome. I feel one or many of these feelings. And thank y'all so much for putting some feelings that we have towards the November election. Yeah.
And make sure you keep that open on your phone. We're going to revisit it as well just a little bit later in today's session.
Mm-hmm. There we go.
Awesome. So now we're just going to talk really briefly about power. We hear this word a lot, but what does it actually mean? In community organizing and when we're trying to increase civic engagement in our communities, we talk about power as the ability to achieve purpose. And this can also be stated as the strength that we require in order to bring about the social, political, and economic change. And so that definition, sure, it might be a little bit confusing, but to simplify it, I love to say that the power that we can build as a community is our ability to make change. And it is up to us to decide what kind of changes we want to see in our own community. And so these can be things like accessibility changes. Maybe we want to see, folks who are, differently abled or other religious groups being more included. It can be things like policy changes, like if you care about healthcare policy, gun safety, reproductive justice, so on and so forth. Power is how we actually make some of those changes. And so we'll talk about some of the different ways we can build power on the next slides.
Yeah, so just to expand a little bit more about power. So, power is the influence created by the relationship between interests and resources. So, interests are what people need or want. These can be things like money, power, enacting specific policy change, or to have healthcare, or even our religious freedom protected. And then resources are assets. So, these can be things like our community members, our community spaces, the money we have, our votes, and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna hone in on these two images right here on our left side. So on the first image, awesome, like I would say that this first image is just like more organized. You can see that we have like a hospital and then a police station just like a mile or a roundabout away. I would say things look a little bit organized. And then with that second image, this you can see off of like any highway exit. I would say that this image looks a little bit more like chaotic. You see like a gas station, and then just another street away, we see another gas station. So just to talk a little bit about these images, if we would want to get to that first image, we just have to use our power that we have to influence and affect positive change. So yeah,
Definitely. And
just
I'll
some
just add
things.
a little bit more on that. The bottom left image, the one that shows, the McDonald's, the gas station, so on and so forth, that is our reality. On top of it, we see, what could be seen in a children's playroom. I had one of these growing up. I don't know if you guys had them or maybe have them for your children, or other family members. But this is what had always honed in me the idea of this is what a community looks like. So we have the expectation at the top that what we're set with versus the reality at the bottom. And so power, if we leverage our assets and we mobilize them towards our interests, that is one of the ways we can shift this reality to what we actually expect it to be and make our communities more sustainable, more healthy, and more, joyful and happy long term as well.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Awesome.
Awesome. So now we'll just talk very briefly about the importance of building power and voting. So voting is just one of the many ways that we can build power as a community. It is just one tool that we have at our disposal in our larger toolbox of civic engagement opportunities. And it generally allows us to have a stake in our community by voting for policies and candidates that represent our values and the issues that we would like to see be addressed. It is just one of many ways that we can build power to affect that positive change that we'd like to see within our community. And so when we think about voting, I want you guys to start thinking of things like community resources. So voting can impact how many resources are going to our school system. Our elected officials that we elect can decide whether or not our communities have access to things like parks and public transportation, and whether that pesky pothole outside of your driveway or in the middle of road is actually getting addressed, or it's letting to sit and fester and just get worse over time. We also want to think about things including the health and security of our communities. So voting can help us decide or help increase our general access to adequate healthcare. It can make sure that we have job security and that within that job security, we're getting paid equitably for our work by making sure that these elected officials know how much our labor is worth. And it can help determine our policies around gun safety and criminal justice within our communities. Obviously, that is very relevant. Unfortunately, here in Georgia, just a couple months ago, we had a mass shooting at a high school, at a local high school in Winder. And so this is just something that if we had better elected officials who could enact better policies, that may have been prevented. And then lastly, you will also generally, through all these issues, want to think about representation. These are just some of the issues that we care about, but there are plenty more that you guys may care about as well. And are the issues that you care about being represented across various levels of government? If not, then it's time to elect people who actually represent these issues, either from our community or people who are allies to our community, or maybe in the future, one of you guys can be that elected official who speaks on behalf of our community. And the other thing is, do we actually know who our elected officials are? I want to say that again. Do you know who your elected officials are? Not just on the federal level, with your US senator, your congressperson, but on the state and local level. And that is really important because if these people aren't taking the time to come and reach out to our communities and talk to us, then they're not going to understand what our needs are or what issues we're facing. And so if they don't do that, we have to be that stepping stone in order to reach out to them and bridge that gap. And if they're still not listening to us, then it is not only our job, but our responsibility to elect and vote somebody in that office who better represents our communities, our values, and has knowledge of the issues that we face.
Okay, so we have a quick question for y'all to join in and answer. Asim will go ahead and reshare the link in the chat for us, and we're just gonna wait on y'all to join real quick. Sorry, I went ahead and started it. We're gonna join in, and y'all are gonna ask or answer a quick question for us, just for us to keep track of what y'all are understanding, and then help clarify anything that we don't.
Yeah, and for some of you who may have logged off, it just takes a second to reload to get back on that screen, and then all you have to do is tap ready as soon as you're ready. But please, participate. We'd love to get your input and test your knowledge as well. I'm a big fan of these emojis coming up.
I was just about to say, I love these emojis.
Awesome. If we can have that fifth person join, my note says five of us are on here. That would be great. Okay, no worries. I think we can go ahead and start.
All right, let's do this. Okay. The question is, what role does voting play in empowering our communities? Y'all have about like 30 seconds to decide. So some of the answer choices are: it provides us an opportunity to celebrate civic holidays only. Voting is only important during presidential elections. Voting has no impact on community issues and concerns. All right. It looks like everyone has answered. Yeah, so the correct answer was it allows us to voice our opinions and influence local government decisions. That's a huge role that voting has in empowering our communities. Yeah, exciting. Okay, let's keep going. There we go.
Okay, so now that we've talked about that, we're going to talk about some of the ways that our power as the Muslim community has actually come in action or how it has manifested in recent years. So one of the first things that I'd want to talk about is Muslim elected officials and representative policies. Alhamdulillah, our community has been able to elect Muslims to represent our values in various levels of government, including at the city level, in the county level, and at the state level as well. To highlight a few, we have a Muslim city councilor in city of Atlanta. In Fulton County, we have a county commissioner, Sister Khadija Abdurrahman. And then at the state level, alhamdulillah, we actually have four Muslim elected officials, two in the state house and two in the state senate. And this is actually the second most out of any state in the United States for the state legislator level, which is incredible to see. And that is directly as a result of Muslim community members being active, both civically and in elections in recent years. And as a result as well, we've also been able to enact policies that increase engagement through language access as well. So things like increasing Arabic as being one of the languages that materials are being translated into. In DeKalb County, actually, I believe they've added Amharic as one of the languages that they're translating their voter materials into for voting and elections this year. So that's hopefully just to name one of some of the ways that our civic engagement has increased our representation and the policies that represent our communities. Second point I'll move on to is Muslim recognition in schools. Different communities have advocated for Eid to be recognized on school calendars in different ways. One of these pushes, actually in Gwinnett County, had multiple offerings within the school calendars for the year, including Eid, or to have included Eid, which is really great to see. And halal school lunches are actually being offered in multiple counties across Georgia, including in Gwinnett County and I believe in Cherokee County as well. And that is directly as a result of our community mobilizing for these issues and advocating to our elected officials to be included and to be represented in these ways. And then lastly, our community is just getting recognized and giving more recognition as time goes on. Muslim communities have been recognized for our contribution in various fields, from education to health to the sciences, so on and so forth. And our history and heritage are recognized in initiatives such as Muslim American Heritage Month, which has actually been taken up by, I believe, in multiple counties, as well as a lot of cities across the state. And so hopefully this just goes to show that we have had a lot of good impact as a result of our historic participation. And so we cannot let, our power that we built to fall down. And we have to keep building on that power to not only continue addressing the issues that we face in our community, but also continuing to normalize Muslims being within these spaces that we historically have not been always welcomed in as much.
Yeah, and then piggybacking off of Asim, I just want to take a minute to focus on this picture. This is taken during Muslim Advocacy Day, where we bring community members to the Capitol for them to meet their elected officials face to face, just for your elected officials to have a face to the name. Because at the end of the day, they are representing you and your community's interest. So it's a great opportunity for us to meet with them, and that happens around every year, early in the year, during legislative sessions. Yeah. Now we'll be talking about voting in 2024. So with the November general election, voter registration deadline was October 7th. So if you register to vote by October 7th, you are able to vote in this November election. And early voting began in October 15th and ends November 1st. Election day is on Tuesday, November 5th. And in most places, polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I'm going to have Asim link this QR code link in the chat. It's a very resourceful website. It's for you to figure out where your polling locations are, early and day of polling locations, and then the timings as well. So yeah, I love this
Definitely.
resource.
And I'll just add one thing onto there. So our voter landing page, we'll talk about that a little bit more later in today's presentation. I will be dropping one more link in the chat, and this is to check your voter registration and also find your polling location if you plan to vote on election day. As Archila mentioned, early voting is only ongoing until this Friday, November 1st. And so if you don't make it to the polls by this Friday, your last opportunity to vote this year is going to be Tuesday, November 5th on election day. And you can vote from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., just to reiterate that. But we heavily encourage, if you once you make your decisions on who you want to vote for, voting early is a great way to avoid lines because as expected, a lot of people will likely be voting on election day. And so it's probably going to be easier for you to get in and out very quickly if you vote by Friday versus waiting until Tuesday to do so. But if you're not able to, then Tuesday, again, is your last opportunity. Visit that link that I dropped in the chat. It's mvp.sos.ga.gov to check your voter registration status, make sure it's up to date. And then also it'll tell you where you will vote on election day. If you're wanting to vote early, you can use that first link, jmvp.org/vote, to find early voting locations in your county.
All right.
Okay, so now we're going to move into a discussion of what's actually on the ballot in 2024. And we'll share a really useful resource for you guys to look up your own ballot, read the candidate profiles who will appear on your ballot, and then make your selections and take them with you to go vote.
Yeah, so just like Asim was saying, this is the website that he was just talking about. With this, all you have to do is input your address and it shows you the districts that you're in, and you're able to check what's going to be on your ballot and then who is going to be on your ballot. So you can read and compare those candidate profiles, which show their different stances on like education, voting rights, and much, much more. And then with that, you can select who you decide to want to vote in. And then you can either print it out or write it down. And it's important to note that you cannot use your phone at the booth. So it's very resourceful to use our branch tool and figure out who you want to vote for, and then maybe even just write it down, or you can select it and then print it out as well. So great resource. Love it.
Definitely. And what I would recommend as well is if you guys want to take a second to put in your address, access this tool either on your phone or on the device you're on, follow along with us as we walk through different offices to see who specifically is going to appear on your ballot so that you can relate their responsibilities and how it impacts you to who is actually running in your specific districts. Obviously, we'll have a lot of the same folks we'll have the same folks running for president. We'll have different folks running for US Congress. And then as we get increasingly local to our state races and then our county races, it's going to be different for everybody depending on which area you live in. And so this tool should be that one-stop shop for you to find all the information you need before you vote this year, inshallah.
Yep, couldn't have said it better myself. Awesome.
Awesome. So now we're going to move into a discussion of some of the offices, the important offices that will appear on your ballot, and how they impact you. So we're not going to highlight every single office, but we'll highlight the ones that we think are most important, and that ones that impact us the most in our day-to-day. So obviously, we had to start with the US president. This is the one that everybody has been talking about. And the US president is just the leader of the executive branch. And they are responsible for implementing and enforcing laws written by Congress. They can also propose different legislation and win support from members of Congress, those being the people who are our US senators and our US representatives. And so presidents will come in with specific agendas in mind. Maybe they want to address immigration. Maybe they want to address foreign policy. Maybe they want to address healthcare access, so on and so forth. And they will propose different legislation, have Congress write that legislation, win support from different members to get that passed. And then eventually they'll be able to pass that legislation if they choose to do so, or they can veto legislation that they don't agree with, which then can only be overridden by a 2/3 vote from Congress. Another wide-ranging power of the US president is the ability to pass executive orders without the approval of Congress. And so one of the most historic examples of this that I think a lot of people actually are not aware of is during World War II, President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, established Japanese internment camps where they rounded up, Japanese American citizens and Japanese immigrants and put them in specific areas to better monitor them during World War II. And so that's not shared to scare you, but that's shared to just showcase what the wide power of this office can be. And then lastly, they are also commander in chief of the armed forces, which encompasses all of our military forces in the US. And then they're the ones who have sole nuclear launch authority as well. And then lastly, and one of the ways that this can actually impact you very closely is the president will appoint and manage the VP or the vice president and their cabinet, which include the heads of different executive departments. And these can range from things like the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Education, so on and so forth, which all oversee specific issue areas. So generally how this impacts you, I argue that yes, the president does have a lot of impact on us generally, but on our day-to-day lives, the actions of the president don't have as much impact as some of the local offices do. But how this impacts you generally will impact our standard of living. Obviously, we've seen that the US president has a great impact on foreign affairs and policy. And then lastly, the US president can also determine the availability of different federal resources to things like infrastructure, to healthcare, to education and transportation, among other issues. So how much they're investing in our state and the other states around the US.
All right, so another office that we have up for election is our United States representatives. So some of their responsibilities is that your congressional representative represents the interest of your district in the US House. Representatives are elected for 2-year terms, and they author, sponsor, debate, and vote on bills that can become national law. It's important to note that they also oversee expenditure for taxes. They also serve on congressional committees that focus on various issues such as transportation, education, and labor, and much, much more. They also conduct oversight of the executive branch. And then with how this impacts you is public infrastructure, so your roads, bridges, and interstate public transit. And then with taxes, so the US House of Representatives determines the federal government spending and how those taxes are spent. So this is an important election or race up for election this year. So yeah. Oh my gosh. There we go.
Awesome. So now, as you guys can see, we're going from federal all the way to local. So right now we're at the state level with the Georgia General Assembly. This body has some of the most direct day-to-day influence on our lives here in the state of Georgia. And just to give you guys some more information, the Georgia General Assembly is a bicameral legislature, meaning it's two houses, and it's composed of the Georgia House of Representatives and the Georgia State Senate, similar to what it looks like on the federal level. So your state senators and state representatives are touched to represent the interests of your local district in the Georgia General Assembly, and each of them are elected to 2-year terms, meaning that every single one of these people are up for re-election this year, if you weren't already aware. There are 56 state senators and 180 state representatives who all represent different areas in Georgia. And each of us has one state senator and one state representative who represent our communities and our specific areas that we live in. These folks can author, can sponsor, and vote on bills that have the opportunity to become state law, so affecting all Georgians. And they will do this primarily by serving on various committees that will look at various issues, including health, education, transportation, voting, and elections, and among many other issues. So I would argue again that the Georgia General Assembly has some of the most direct impact on our day-to-day lives, and we'll highlight some of the things that we have seen come out of the Georgia General Assembly in recent years. As Arshila mentioned, both Arshila and I are policy advocates within the Georgia General Assembly on behalf of Georgia Muslim Voter Project. And so we are at the Capitol at the beginning of every year for legislative session, tracking these bills, monitoring them, and advocating for bills that help our community and against bills that harm our community. And so some of the things we've seen are bills that impact things like voting. So they'll implement laws that impact early voting, absentee voting, how the voter registration process looks, and our access to things like vote by mail drop boxes or absentee ballot drop boxes. They'll also impact things like our access to public education. So if you have, I am a product of public education. I believe Arshila is as well. Many of you, may have gone through public school or have students who are attending Georgia public schools. So they have passed laws that allow things such as school vouchers, which take money from public schools and allow them to go to private schools instead, essentially defunding public schools in some ways, that impact charter schools, and that also impact things like in-state tuition for public universities and colleges in Georgia for undocumented or immigrant students. Another thing that the Georgia General Assembly will address is healthcare. So things like Medicaid and Medicare expansion here in Georgia, and they can also help determine the price of our healthcare and what insurance costs actually look like. Another thing that is sort of a little bit out of left field that the General Assembly can also determine is things like economic growth. For example, bills aimed at encouraging economic development. I don't know if anybody here is a superhero fan or specifically a Marvel fan, likes the movies or TV shows. I'm somewhat of a fan myself. Um, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but a lot of these films and TV shows are actually filmed right here in Georgia. And that is directly because of an incentive law passed by the state government that reduces the amount of taxes that these film and studio companies have to pay when they film here versus filming in other states. And then lastly, one of the most direct ways that the General Assembly has impacted us in recent years is through bills that address social movements in different ways. So things like the Black Lives Matter movement, like the Stop Cop City movement, and of course, the Palestinian liberation movement here in the United States. So these affect things such as we've seen a bill that uh, basically implements the IRA definition or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism as the state definition of anti-Semitism. And what that does is it equates Zionism or anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as being the same thing. So, for example, if you oppose the state of Israel because of their human rights violation to our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and you potentially, deny, an Israeli or a Jewish citizen from renting your home if you're a landowner, and they find your tweets about talking about free Palestine or that you don't like the state of Israel, that can lead to potentially some sort of criminal charge. Another thing is the racketeering charge expansion. So potentially trying to criminalize things like flyering for different things, like knocking on people's doors without their permission, so on and so forth. And then another thing that we've seen, which thankfully didn't pass thanks to organizations like ourselves, like Cara Georgia, like others who were fighting against these issues, are bills aimed at criminalizing protest in one way. And one of these bills that we saw was actually so ridiculous, I just have to share it. One tenet of one of these bills that tried to criminalize protest allowed for people to hit protesters with their cars and get away with impunity if they were feeling threatened by these people. And so this just goes to show that these people have legislated or have tried to legislate and will continue to try to legislate our lives, our access to ballots, our education, our right to protest, and our free speech rights as well. And so it's our opportunity to elect people who better represent our values in these spaces and continue to hold those people accountable come legislative session in 2025.
All right. Another local election we have is our Board of Education. So some responsibilities of the Board of Education is that they run the local public school system and they're elected for 4-year terms. The Georgia School Board members create the annual school budget, they set school policies, and they even hire superintendents or principals. The Board of Education also handles security, race, gender equality, and public health concerns in the local public school system. It's important to note that many school districts will have a Board of Education seat up for election this year. It's also important to note that some of these Board of Education seats were nonpartisan, meaning that they weren't affiliated with any political party, and they were held back in May. So you may have a Board of Education seat up for election, or it may have been elected back in May. With how this impacts you, so taxes. The school board holds a large portion of your tax dollars, including property tax and sales taxes. So if you are interested in knowing where your tax dollars are going, a large portion is going to the Board of Education. Next, with school resources. So the budget determines teacher pay, classroom resources, and which services to provide. With student success, so courses and training available to students. And then lastly, accessibility. So language policies and religious accessibilities. It's important to know that religious accessibilities, one of GAMVP's policy priorities is trying to implement halal school lunches and securing a place for students to pray on Fridays. So most of this is done with the Board of Education and us communicating with them. So another important race up for election this year.
Definitely. And I'll just add some more context as well. I know Arshila mentioned that the some of the school board elections are nonpartisan and will have been held in May. And so we have actually, in some areas across the state, for example, if you're a Gwinnett County resident, you have already voted for these people or in May, or you already have the opportunity to do so. But for the others, make sure to reference that ballot lookup tool, gamvp.org/ballot we shared earlier, because that will tell you in your specific area if you have a Board of Education race for your local public school system taking place this November as well. But just to reiterate, some of us, I believe off the top of my head, Gwinnett County, for the most part, have already voted for these earlier this year in May during the primary election.
Yeah. Okay.
And so next up, we will talk about the county commissioners. So this is an often under viewed office, but it does have a lot of impact on our day-to-day lives and around our entire counties that we live in. So county commissioners create and pass laws at the county level that impact things such as our property and sales tax rates, the public transportation that's offered within a county, and what infrastructure is available to us. County commissioners are elected to 4-year terms and they're staggered, basically meaning that we don't re-elect all of them at the same time. We'll re-elect one year and then, 2 years pass, we'll re-elect another one, so on and so forth. Their responsibility is preparing and passing a county budget, which determines how much funding goes to public services, including roads and laws in law enforcement, for example. But again, they can pass laws that impact the entire county level as well. And each commissioner will represent a different district around the county. So we may have different commissioners representing us depending on which area of a specific county you reside within. How this impacts you, it can impact you in a number of ways. Number one, if you live in an area that is very car dependent, like the Metro Atlanta area, for example, this can impact how much money is allocated to things like public transportation, such as MARTA or bus lines. We'll actually talk about some of the referendums that relate to public transportation in Cobb and Gwinnett in a few slides, but that can also be related to the responsibilities of the county commissioner. They also have an influence on our taxes as well. And so they have an influence on property and sales tax rates within a county, and they can determine what those rates are for that specific county. And then lastly, they have a lot of power over zoning. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, zoning is basically the process of these people deciding which areas within a county are going to be built up for residential things such as houses, such as apartment complexes, for commercial reasons such as businesses, shopping plaza, so on and so forth, or for industrial reasons such as, factories or processing plants. And so they oversee zoning for unincorporated areas within county limits. And basically, what an unincorporated area is an area that falls within a county, but it's not within city limits. So, for example, I live in DeKalb County, and two of the biggest cities in DeKalb County are Decatur and part of city of Atlanta. But I don't live within either of those city boundaries. So I technically live within unincorporated DeKalb. And so instead of being represented by a city councilor who may determine a lot of these things, as we'll get into, I'm instead represented by a county commissioner. So I can take my public transportation, my zoning, and my taxes concerns directly to them to address whatever issues I face.
All right. And then lastly, some additional local offices that are up for election. So it's important to note that you may have these up for election or you may not. But obviously, we want to highlight them just for your information as well. So first and foremost, the sheriff. So the sheriff is responsible for law enforcement on a county level and maintaining that order. This includes operating county jails, providing court security, executing arrest warrants, and then serving those unincorporated areas that Asim was talking about before. And then with district attorney, so your district attorney represents the government in prosecuting felony criminal cases. They basically have the decision of whether or not to bring charges against arrested individuals, and they're going to be the ones to build the case against these arrested individuals. And then lastly, the tax commissioner. So the tax commissioner oversees the phases of the taxing process. This includes billing, collecting, processing, and distributing taxes. And they're also in charge of property taxes, solid waste fees, public utilities, and renewing your vehicle tag. It's important to note that the tax commissioner does not determine the tax rates. So you may have these additional offices up for election and you may not, but you can use our ballot branch lookup tool and you can see if you have a sheriff or a district attorney or a tax commissioner up for election. And you can stay knowledgeable about all the offices that are up for election. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Arshila. As she mentioned, we have a lot of different races on our ballots depending on the areas we live in. And so I just dropped the link for the ballot lookup tool as well, once again. So make sure to always go back and refer to that. That's going to be your one-stop shop for finding personalized information on who's on your ballot, being able to compare candidate profiles on the issues you care about, whether it's education, healthcare, gun safety, so on and so forth. And then ultimately printing out or writing down your choices and taking them to go vote by this Friday, November 1st, or on election day next week, Tuesday, November 5th. So now that we've talked about all of that, we're going to go ahead and head into some of the constitutional amendments and referendums that are going to be up here on the ballot. And so we'll talk about what the scope of these amendments or referendums are, how they appear on the ballot, what they actually do, and then we'll also say and mention what proponents of these amendments say and then what critics say. So we'll hopefully give you guys a good understanding of the entire scope of how this could impact us. But let's go ahead and move to the first one. So our first constitutional amendment is relating to homestead exemptions. So the description of this is that it provides for a local option homestead property tax exemption and allows a county, municipality, or school system to opt out of that exemption. I know that's a lot of fancy words, and so we'll talk about how this appears on the ballot and then what it actually means. So this will appear on the ballot the following way. Shall the Constitution of Georgia be amended so as to authorize the General Assembly to provide by general law for a statewide homestead exemption that serves to limit increases in the assessed value of homesteads, but which any county, consolidated government, municipality, or local school system may opt out of upon the completion of certain procedures. So again, I don't know why they don't write them in ways that are always accessible for folks, but let's talk about what this actually means on the next slide. And so let's talk about what this would do. So this measure is designed to slow property tax hikes that occur when home values rise. So as we know, we've been dealing with a lot of inflation recently. And so this measure was proposed in order to slow how much our property taxes could be raised each year. So if voters approved the amendment, home property assessments would be capped at the inflation rate for the previous year. And so if this would go into effect next year, they would be capped for what the inflation rate is this year. And they said by holding down assessment increases, property tax increases would also be limited since they are based on the assessed value of a home and the property tax rates. The proposal would also allow governments to use revenue from a 1% sales tax to increase to lower property tax if voters approve a local referendum to increase the sales tax. So this is something that they're saying the local governments would have to do in addition to this through an additional referendum that voters would vote on. And if the constitutional amendment is passed, then municipalities, so local cities, would have to between January 1st and March 1st to opt out of that cap, basically not cap the home values or the property tax raises. And local officials would have to pass a resolution and hold specifically 3 public hearings in order to opt out and hear from voters what they would say. And so there's a lot of back and forth on the bill, but let's share what supporters say and what opponents say. Supporters say that this constitutional amendment would help homeowners who face big increases in their property tax bills. Meanwhile, the opponents call it a regressive tax that would actually shift the tax burden onto the poorest Georgians and decrease funding for schools. And so, just to give you a little bit more insight on why they say that, basically, the regressive tax would shift the tax burden on poor Georgians by increasing taxes in another way. So, if this is passed, or this could potentially, the money that they would get from property taxes, they would have to make up for it in other ways by increasing different types of taxes around their city or municipality. And as we mentioned earlier, specifically for school board, a lot of the funding that comes from school board is actually derived from property taxes. And so some people argue that if were to be implemented, the tax burden would actually decrease funding for schools. And as we know, unfortunately, a lot of our schools in the state are already underfunded. And so people worry that this may even ameliorate that or add to that in some capacity. So that is the first constitutional amendment that will appear on our ballots this year. And let's move on to the next one. So the second constitutional amendment is around a Georgia tax court. And the description of it is to create the Georgia tax court with statewide jurisdiction as provided by law, and it'll appear on the ballot in the following way. Shall the Constitution of Georgia be amended so as to provide for the Georgia tax court to be vested with the judicial power of the state and have venues, judges, and jurisdiction concurrent with superior courts? So again, this language isn't always accessible. Let's talk about what this means on the next slide. So this would do actually quite a lot and would impact our the way that our courts are set up a little bit generally. So this amendment would create a state tax court responsible for handling complaints involving the State Department of Revenue. So any complaints related to any of the processes or work from the Department of Revenue within Georgia. Currently, we have a Georgia Tax Tribunal, which hears these types of cases. And it is housed in the executive branch of Georgia, so the governor's seat, and the governor is able to appoint the chief judge. Any appeals that go to the tribunal or start from the tribunal actually go to the Fulton County Superior Court because the tribunal is an administrative court in the executive branch. And so they have to pass along that to a superior court in order to address it. This amendment would do away with the tribunal and create the Georgia tax court in the judiciary branch. And so instead of it being housed in the executive, where the governor will appoint it, it'll instead be housed in the judicial branch within Georgia, which includes our state Supreme Court. And so the new tax court would have a chief judge appointed by the governor, just like the current process. But instead, with the new tax court, appeals would go directly to the Court of Appeals without having to go through the Fulton County Superior Court. And so I know that might still be a little bit confusing. So let's talk about what supporters of this amendment say and what opponents say. Supporters say that this tax court being created would streamline the appeals process and make tax cases move quicker because they wouldn't have to go from the tax tribunal to the Fulton County Superior Court. and then potentially to the Georgia Court of Appeals if there are appeals that need to be heard. But opponents say that setting up the new tax court would be costly, and they claim it takes away our ability as Georgians to represent ourselves in tax cases. One of the things being said around it being costly is, if there is going to be an implementation of a new court, it already costs, a certain amount of money in order to facilitate the Fulton County Superior Court and the tax tribunal as is. And so to set up an entirely new court would just add to that burden that is going to be potentially on taxpayers as well. And so now let's move on to our last ballot measure, which is actually a statewide referendum. Okay, so this last statewide referendum discusses personal property tax exemption. And the description of it is to increase the personal property tax exemption from 7,500 to 20,000. And so this is how it appears on your ballot. Do you approve the act that increases an exemption from property tax for all tangible personal property from 7,500 to $20,000? And the reason it appears like this is because this comes from a bill passed by the Georgia General Assembly to include this as a referendum in this year's election to increase this personal property tax exemption. And so let's talk about on the next slide what this will actually cover for personal property. So this ballot question asks voters to increase the tax exemption for tangible personal property. And so this mostly is referring to things such as business inventory and farm machinery from 7,500 to 20,000. These tax breaks will exclude things like motor vehicles, trailers, and mobile homes, but generally will include like business equipment, business inventory, and other things used for things like farming and agriculture. Currently, when business owners buy equipment, they pay sales tax on that equipment, and then they pay property taxes on the value of that equipment as a whole. And so this is trying to expand what that cost of the equipment could be to limit how much property tax they pay. And so let's move on to what supporters and opponents of these referendums say. Supporters say that this measure reduces unfair taxation on small business owners, which would allow them to reinvest the money that's saved by not having to pay these property taxes, going back into their business. But opponents say that these property taxes could reduce funding allocated to public education and local government functions. And so again, property taxes are also related to our school board funding. And so that's one connection that I want to highlight once again. And a lot of local government functions are paid for through property taxes. And so if they're not able to get property taxes through taxing these personal property items that people use for business, opponents say that other regressive taxes like additional fines or fees may be implemented in order to fill that funding gap that our cities or municipalities, may need in order to reach their funding adequately. And so again, there's a lot of different back and forth on this bill, but hopefully, as a result of us discussing these two constitutional amendments and this statewide referendum, you guys will have a better understanding of how this impacts you, and how, if implemented, these would impact our communities statewide.
All right, so next we're just going to talk about some county-specific transit referendums. So specific to Gwinnett and Cobb County. And first off, I'm going to talk about Gwinnett County. So the Gwinnett County referendum aims to expand projects that will improve mobility across the county. So the referendum would impose a 1% sales tax for up to 30 years. So basically increasing your sales tax by 1%. And what is being proposed is a micro transit expansion to provide 100% county coverage. It also includes an airport ride to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, and then a high capacity transit system like Bus Rapid Transit and Bus Rapid Transit Light. And then it also enhances and expands county coverage by local buses. And then lastly, new transit transfer facilities. So that's what's being proposed in Gwinnett County. And we can look at Cobb County next. So with the Cobb County referendum. The Cobb County referendum proposes a 1 cent sales tax increase to support and expand and improve Cobb County's transit services over the next 30 years, which is estimated to bring in $11 billion. With how this impacts you, so direct regional connections to 3 MARTA Transit, including Dunwoody, Arts Center, and HE Homes. It also improves access to Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and access to major entertainment-wide venues, business hubs, and healthcare facilities. Along with that, county-wide micro transit zones serving everyone, including disabled, veterans, and elderly populations. With that, the transit would link to 7 cities and 3 community improvement districts within the county. It also enhances transit connections to Kennesaw State University, Life University, Chattahoochee Technical College, and other higher education institutions. And lastly, it aims to develop bike and pedestrian pathways to ensure seamless connectivity to the expanded transit network. So that's for Cobb County. So if you live in Gwinnett and Cobb County, these are some referendums that are going to be up for voting in your ballot. So yeah.
Yeah, and I will just say once again, so we mentioned earlier we are a nonpartisan organization, meaning we cannot endorse any political party or a candidate, and we will never tell you who to vote for. But what we can advocate for are beneficial policies that increase access or increase resources for our communities. So we recommend that if you are a Cobb County voter or a Gwinnett County voter and you see these SPLOST options, the Special Project Local Optional Sales Tax, that you vote in favor of them. Um, if you live in Metro Atlanta, you already know how bad traffic gets. And so having alternative options such as reliable public transportation, and like, for example, Gwinnett County mentioning the micro transit options are going to take a lot of people off the roads and make it easier for people who, to drive around, because not everybody will be forced to go in their cars in order to get from place to place. And if you think about a lot of our immigrant and refugee community members, we have a lot, who are escaping war, escaping famine, so many other issues across the world, who may not be eligible to get driver's licenses here in Georgia, unfortunately, due to their status. This is just one of the many ways that we can support them in making sure that they are not only surviving, but thriving, and being able to get around and accessing those economic opportunities that are available to them. So again, if you are in Gwinnett or Cobb County and you see these referendums, we are asking folks to support these referendums and vote yes on them.
There we go.
Awesome. So now we'll just talk about a little bit about GAMVP's voter landing page. And so I'll drop the link in the chat for you guys one more time, or you can scan this QR code with your phones to go to gamvp.org/vote. We'll just talk about some of the important information that we have accessible to our community members here. But definitely want to encourage you to explore this resource and to share this with your community and other folks who are not on today's call at your discretion. But let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the resources we have. And so on the voter landing page, you can find things like important election dates, some of the ones that we've highlighted, some of the important processes for voting early, voting on election day. If you have requested and received an absentee ballot, making sure that to return that on time, all that information is there. Also, knowing your rights as a voter and navigating some of the new voting legislation that has been passed from the Georgia General Assembly in recent years. We just have some reminders there. And then the last thing that I want to uplift, from that ballot lookup tool, you guys should be able to see which House district and which state Senate district you live in. And so if you access our voter landing page, and go to the section that looks exactly like this here at the bottom, where you see House district voter guides and Senate district voter guides, we have identified some really important state Senate and state House races that we want people to be aware of. And so we have actually done a lot of research to inform you on who the candidates are and talk about where they stand on a number of issues from education to healthcare to gun control and public safety, and then also asking them stances on how they feel about Palestinian liberation, how they feel about House Bill 30, so on and so forth. And so if you live within District 46, 48, 86, 97, 99, 105, or 108, please click the links to find your relevant House District voter guide. And then the three Senate districts that we wanted to highlight are Senate District 5, Senate District 7, and Senate District 9. So definitely would encourage you guys to explore this resource, see what information is there, and share this out with other folks who may be within these voter districts. Again, it's really important that we vote our values and elect people who represent us and the issues that we care about into not only local offices, but also statewide offices as well.